Hey, what's up, OneChurch?
And Clarksville.
My name is Seth. I'm a student pastor here at oneChurch.tv.
And I'm Lene. I'm married to this guy, and I'm a small group leader in our student ministry.
We just want to say Happy Easter from everybody here at oneChurch.tv. Thank you so much for joining us today. I know we'd rather be together in person at the theater, watching the service together as a united church, or going to lunch afterwards together and then eating all of the leftover candy from the eggs. You can still do that, by the way. But thank you so much for still choosing to be connected with us here today.
Speaking of being connected, a great way to stay connected is to text Connect1C to 97,000. It's just a great way for us to keep you updated on events and everything going on here.
And on Mondays at around 9 o'clock or so, we send out a text asking how we, as a staff, can pray for you for the week. Because during isolation and self-quarantine, this is an easy way for us to be for you and be the church together. Right now, it's typically at the point of Sunday mornings where we would transfer to giving and offering. And the easiest way to give at oneChurch.tv is through the oneChurch.tv app or oneChurch.tv/give.
And you can also send a check or money order to the address posted on the screen.
Now, what's about to follow is a song, a message, and another song.
I would love to encourage you to sing along with us.
Which is coming from La, because she never likes when I sing. So I would also encourage you to sing, especially if you're a flat singer like me, because no one's around to make you feel pressured to sing well. I hope you enjoyed the message.
I searched the world, but it couldn't fill me. Man's empty praise and treasures of fate are never enough. Then you came along and put me back together. And every desire is now satisfied here in your love. Oh, there's nothing better than you. Oh, there's nothing better than you. Oh, there's nothing is better than you. I'm not afraid to show you my weakness, my failures and flaws. Lord, you've seen them all, and you still call me friend. 'Cause the God of the mountain is the God of the valleys, and there's not a place your mercy and grace won't find me again. Oh, there's nothing better than you. Oh, there's nothing better than you. Oh, there's nothing is better than you. Oh, there's nothing better than you. Oh, there's nothing better than you. Oh, there's nothing is better than you. You turn mourning to dancing. You give beauty for ashes. You turn shame into glory. You're the only one who can. You turn mourning to dancing. You give beauty for ashes. You turn shame into glory. You're the only one who can. You turn graves into gardens. into armies. You turn seas into highways. You're the only one who can. You're the only one who can. Oh, there's nothing better than you, Lord. There's nothing better than you, Lord. There's nothing. Nothing is better than you. Oh, there's nothing better than you. There's nothing better than you. There's nothing. Nothing is better than you. You turn graves into gardens. You turn bones into armies. You turn seas into highways. You're the only one who can. You turn graves into gardens. You turn bones into armies. You turn seas into highways. You're the only one who can. You're the only one who can. You're the only one who can.
There was a man with 2 sons. The younger son told his father, "Father, I want what I'm entitled to right now. I want my share of your estate before you die." So the father agreed and divided his wealth between his sons. A few days later, this younger son, with his newfound wealth, packed all his belongings and rode away without so much as a goodbye. He went off to a distant land, and there he wasted all his money on reckless living. Desperate and starving, he persuaded a local farmer to hire him, and the farmer sent the man into the fields to feed his pigs. He became so hungry that even the pods he was feeding the pigs looked good to him. And it was at that point, when he was there eating the same slop that he was feeding the hogs, that he came to his senses. It was at that point he decided that he must return home to his father. And while he was still long off, his father saw him coming. Filled with love and compassion, the father ran to his son, embraced him, kissed him, and with tear-filled eyes, welcomed him back home. The son, unable to make eye contact, said to his father, "Father, for I have sinned against both heaven and you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son." But instead, the father said to the servants, "We must celebrate with a feast, for this son of mine has returned home. He was dead and is now alive. He was lost and is now found." The older brother was angry and would not go in. The father begged the older brother to please come in, but he replied, "Father, after all these years I've slaved for you and never once refused to do a single thing you told me to. And now this younger son of yours comes back after squandering your money on prostitutes and other foolish behavior, and you celebrate him. Why?" And the father gently smiled and brushed the hair away from the older brother's face and said, "My son, you have always stayed with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate this happy day, for your brother who was foolish came to his senses, who was dead is now alive, and who was lost has now been found."
Well, good morning, oneChurch.tv. What's up? My name is Carlo. I get to be one of the teaching pastors here, and I'm so glad that you are connecting with us today. Happy Easter. We are so thrilled that we can all be together, even if it's just through this digital way. We are just glad that we can celebrate the resurrection of Jesus together. For thousands of years, people who have followed Christ have paused intentionally on this day that we call Easter to just make a big deal about Jesus being alive. He predicted his own death and resurrection and pulled it off, and we think that's a great reason to believe what he has told us. And so we're glad that you are here, wherever you're watching from, however you're watching. We are glad that you are celebrating Easter with us today. I spent Easter of 2003 in Iraq, of all places, and I remember back in 2003, having a conversation with a guy, we're going to call him Will for the sake of this discussion. And one day, Will asked me, what do you plan to do when you get out of the Army? Now, that was a normal question we'd ask each other all the time. But Will asked me, what do I plan to do? And I planned to kind of make, to re-enlist or maybe get out. But I just bluntly answered him and said, listen, I think I'm going to be a pastor. Whether that's as a chaplain in the Army or whether that's out of the Army, I'm going to be a pastor. And he kind of gave me a polite, oh, yeah, that's cool, and then kind of changed the subject. And ever since that moment, Will treated me differently. From that point on, he acted completely different around me. Sometimes out of politeness, he would watch what he said, maybe out of respect for my beliefs. But I think many times he was afraid that I would judge him, that I wouldn't really care about him, that I would leave him, that basically I would treat him differently because I was a follower of Christ and he at the time wasn't. Really what happened is he projected his feelings about God onto me. Now fast forward now, and obviously I'm a pastor, but I've had people ask me those same type of questions 5 minutes into a conversation, and they want to know, who am I? What do I do? What do I believe? That's the questions they ask. And they want to know these things because they're important to them. And these are important questions for sure, but they're not the most important things in life, and they're not the most important things about me. Who you are and what you do and what you believe, they matter, but there's something that matters so much more. And that's what we're going to build this series off of. This series is titled, What God is Really Like. And we want to really dig into this because it's so important. When you're asked questions of what do you do for a living or where are you from, the response you give gives a piece of your life, but it doesn't tell the whole story. There's something that is so much more important about you than just who you are or what you do. Author A.W. Tozer, he said this when asked about what's the most important thing in the knowledge of holy. He said, what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. So the most important thing about us, he says, is what comes into our mind when we think about God. When I say the word God, what comes into your mind? Go ahead and say it out loud right where you are. What comes into your mind when I say God? What do you think about? What images pop into your mind? According to Tozer, he said, whatever that was that flashed into your mind, that's the most important thing about you. Now, another legendary author, C.S. Lewis, who many of you have heard of, he actually read Tozer's quote in real time when they were alive, and he responded to it. Here's what C.S. Lewis says. C.S. Lewis says, I read in a periodical the other day that the fundamental thing is how we think of God. By God, it is not. How God thinks of us is not only more important, but infinitely more important. Indeed, how we think of him is of no importance except insofar as it is related to how he thinks of us. This is like the original Twitter beef, right? You got C.S. Lewis versus A.W. Tozer kind of going back and forth. Who's right, Tozer or Lewis? I think the answer is yes. I think they're both right. I think they're two sides of the same coin. What we think about God matters, and what God thinks about us really matters. For example, there's a lot of talk about God on social right now, and rightfully so. One person said this, maybe God had to remind us that it is not nearly as important where we worship than how we worship. So this is someone speaking of the fact that we can't physically gather. Another person said, I'm not one to ask for much, especially on social media, but I do ask if you can keep my dad in your prayers. He's an Uber Eats driver, and since Tuesday, he hasn't been feeling good. He put himself in isolation. Please, guys, I ask of your prayers. He is my world. Another person said, you really can't just ask God for forgiveness. Forgiveness is paid for. It's more than just a matter of how God thinks. It's the very logic of justice. That's why you won't live in a society where someone could just say sorry after murder. 3 different tweets, three completely different perspectives of God. A lot of God talk. We're all thinking about that right now. For some, God is this guy who won't touch evil, doesn't want to look at evil, will squash out all evil. For others, God is this God who's loving and merciful, and he just wants to forgive and wants us all to move forward. For some, everything bad that happens because of God. For others, God only wants what is good for us. And here's the problem. A lot of what we think and read and hear about God on social is partially true. In fact, many of the times, our expressions of what we think about God are mostly true, but they don't tell the full story. On one side, we think God is permissive and he's tolerant and full of love. On the other side, we see God as this judge and this vindicator of sin, and we want justice as long as God's not judging us. We want God to judge everyone else. But here's what happens. How we think about God ends up determining who we are, what we become, and how we act. It matters. So in this series, we're going to look at what God is really like. But we don't want you to take our word for it. I don't want you to take my word for it. We're going to actually look at a story from the life of Jesus. In fact, a story that Jesus himself told. Jesus who said he was the Son of God. Jesus who died and rose again from the dead. So we're going to take his word as the authority for what God is really like, because according to what we read in the teachings of Jesus, he's the only one qualified to really show us what God is like. And we're going to look at him and we're going to drill down into that because it's very important that we get God right. Listen, at oneChurch.tv, we know that life is hard and we want to help you with life. But here's one thing we know. It's tough to get life right when you've got God wrong. It's tough to get life right when you've got God wrong. So we want to know what God is really like because we know it matters. All right, so let's look at Luke chapter 15. This is a famous series of stories that Jesus told, but I think they help us see what God is really like. I'm going to start reading Luke 15, verse 1. Here's what it says. Tax collectors and other notorious sinners often came to listen to Jesus teach. So tax collectors, they were considered the worst people of their day. The tax collectors were primarily Jewish men who worked for the occupying Roman government. And so to the average Jewish person, this person was a traitor to what it meant to be Jewish, and they represented the evil of Rome in that day. So they were worse. But worse than that were these sinners. These are people who just didn't care about the Hebrew scriptures. They didn't care about living and following the law of Moses that the Hebrews followed. They just didn't really care about their life. They did their thing. And so in religious circles, this was not a group that you would imagine someone like a respected religious teacher like Jesus to be hanging around. And so making a big point there, the tax collectors and notorious sinners, those are the ones that were around Jesus. Verse 2. This made the Pharisees and teachers of religious law complain that he, Jesus, was associating with such sinful people, even eating with them. So Jesus told them this story. And what happens next in Luke 15, we don't have time to really get into all of it, but Jesus begins to tell a series of stories to the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. They couldn't believe that Jesus, this supposed rabbi, religious teacher, was hanging around these notoriously sinful people. And so Jesus responds to them through this story. Jesus is unlike anyone who had ever come before. In fact, he's rewriting in real time what it means to be a leader and a servant, and especially an authority. What he was rewriting to the Jewish people, what it meant to know about God. He was actually telling a new story, a better story of here is what God is really like. And so he tells three stories. We're going to focus on the last one, but he tells three stories. He starts by talking about lost things, and then he moves all the way to lost relationships. And in each of those stories, Jesus ends with this statement. This is what it's like in the kingdom of heaven. At the end of all three of these stories, he basically summarizes them by saying, this is what the kingdom of heaven is like. This is what God likes. Or, this is what God is really like. And then, after sharing a couple of stories about lost things, Jesus really drills down and he talks about a lost relationship, a lost person. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to read it to you from the story. It's found in Luke chapter 15, verse 11. I'm going to read this entire story, and we're going to come back and revisit this in the next 2 weeks, but we're just going to read this story in its entirety and then talk about that a little bit. Here's what it says in Luke 15, verse 11 through 31. Follow along at home. Pull out your phone. Grab that big Bible you might have on your coffee table if you're kind of old school, or dust one off of the shelf, but just take a moment right now. Grab that Bible, sit together with your family or wherever you're at, and pull it up, and I want you to read this story along with me. Luke 15, verse 11. I'm reading out of the New Living Translation. Here's what it says. To illustrate the point further, Jesus told them this story. A man had 2 sons, and the younger son told his father, I want my share of your estate now before you die. So his father agreed to divide his wealth between his sons. A few days later, the younger son packed all his belongings and moved to a distant land, and there he wasted all his money on wild living. About the time his money ran out, a great famine swept over the land, and he began to starve. And he persuaded a local farmer to hire him, and the man sent him into his fields to feed the pigs. The young man became so hungry that even the pods he was feeding the pigs looked good to him, but no one gave him anything. So what you have in this story is a very wealthy, well-off, generous father whose son comes up to him and says, hey, Dad, I wish you were dead, but since you're not, give me your inheritance now. And the father gives him what he asks for. The son goes off, wild living, burns through all his cash. And now this Jewish man who was raised to know not to eat any pork, now he's actually looking at the food that the pork eats, and he's actually considering eating it. So he's just wrecked his life. Verse 17. When he finally came to his senses, he said to himself, at home, even the hired servants have enough to spare, and here I am dying of hunger. I will go home to my father and say, Father, I have sinned against both heaven and you. I am no longer worthy of being called your son. Please take me on as a hired servant. So he came to his wits' end, he's at rock bottom, and he comes up with this awesome speech of what he's going to tell his dad that might convince him to be able to get off of the streets, be able to make a little money, and more importantly, not have to eat pig food. Verse 20, so he returned home to his father, and while he was still a long way off, his father saw him coming. Filled with love and compassion, he ran to his son, embraced him, and kissed him. And his son said to him, Father, I have sinned against both heaven and you, and I am no longer worthy of being called your son. But his father said to the servants, quick, bring the finest robe in the house and put it on him. Get a ring for his finger and sandals for his feet, and kill the calf we've been fattening. We must celebrate with a feast, for this son of mine was dead and has now returned to life. He was lost, but now he is found. And so the party began. Meanwhile, the oldest son was in the fields, working. When he returned home, he heard music and dancing in his house, and he asked one of the servants, what's going on? Your brother's back, he was told, and your father has killed the fatted calf. We are celebrating because of his safe return. The older brother was angry and wouldn't go in. His father came out and begged him, but he replied, all these years I've slaved for you, and all this time you never gave me even one young goat for a feast with my friends. Yet when this son of yours comes back, after squandering your money on prostitutes, you celebrate by killing the fatted calf. And his father said to him, look, dear son, you have always stayed by me, and everything that I have is yours. We had to celebrate this happy day, for your brother was dead and has come back to life. He was lost and is now found. Powerful story. You might have heard of it as the parable of the lost son or the prodigal son, but it's a powerful story. Now let me ask you a question. Who was this story directed to? Stories of Jesus, we call them parables. Who was this parable directed to? It wasn't the sinners. In fact, Jesus directed this story to people who thought they knew what God was like. He directed it to the Pharisees, to religious leaders, to people who thought they had God figured out. He said, this is what the kingdom of heaven is really like. This is what God is really like. And as we're going to see, everyone who's in this crowd, they're missing it. They're missing what God is really like. Based on this parable, let me ask you another question. How does Jesus want us to think about God? Based on this story that Jesus just told this crowd and that we've heard Jesus tell us through the Bible, how does Jesus want us to think of God? I don't think Jesus wants us to think about God as this bringer of disaster, as this keeper of all judgment. as this tyrant waiting to strike us down the minute we mess up. I don't think Jesus wants us to think of God as someone who is absent or someone who will abandon us or someone who will forget us. I don't think Jesus wants us to think of God as someone who is so high and lofty that he's indifferent to our cares. I don't think Jesus wants us to think of God as some inanimate, mystical thing that we can never really grasp. I think Jesus wants us to think about God as a father. Jesus wants us to think of God as Father. In fact, he mentions the word Father about 10 times in that story. Now, for some of you, that's hard to understand and that's hard to swallow. It's very difficult to think about God as a father because you might have had a terrible experience with your father. You may ask, why did Jesus use father as an example of all the things that he could have done instead of mother or instead of a big fancy bird? Why did he pick father of all of those? Let's talk about that for a little bit. I am not ignorant of the fact that earthly fathers blow it all of the time. Statistics show us that there's so many young men and young women who grow up in homes without fathers. We understand that our dads on this earth mess up and they blow it. And we got to understand that as Jesus is telling this story to that original crowd, he picked an illustration that would serve them. He picked the best illustration he could think of in that context for those people so that they could understand. He was accommodating to them, but he didn't give them the 100% full picture about God. He just picked one example out of many examples to show what God is not. God is not male. God is not like your earthly father. He's God. He's this massive, awesome creator of everything. But Jesus picked this example for a reason. So for some of you, you hear about God being a father, and that's just really tough because you have terrible, terrible thoughts about the word father. But Jesus used this illustration over and over and over again for a reason. In fact, when Jesus taught his disciples how to pray, he said, pray like this, our Father in heaven. He used that word for a reason. Let me just encourage you, don't let what's wrong with your earthly father or what's wrong with earthly fathers, human fathers, don't let what's wrong with us keep you from understanding and wanting to know all that is right with God. If we get God wrong, it's really hard to get life right. As we're going to see as we work through this parable over the next couple of weeks, that God as a father is actually a pretty good thing. God as Father is actually an amazing way to think about God. Think about the story that you just heard. This lost son, this father who gave him everything, this brother who's kind of envious, this father who takes this lost son back. Think about all those things, and how would you describe the father we see in Luke 15? Here's just a couple of words, adjectives, that really show us what we can see from that father. He was successful. He obviously had wealth to give away. He was sacrificial. He was willing to pay this high price to teach his son a lesson or to let his son have his own way. He was responsive. The son came to him, "Hey, Dad, give me my inheritance now." He responded to his son both when his son left and when his son returned. He was fair. He told his older brother, "Hey, you have everything that you need. I haven't withheld what you think I've withheld from you." He was generous. He gave above and beyond, and he was trusting. More than that, as we remember that story we just read, God the Father is patient. It said that while the son was a far way off, the father was there. He was patient as his younger son figured out life. He was hopeful. He was expecting his son to return back. And when his son returned, God the Father was compassionate, not judgmental, not harsh. I put myself into that story, and all I can think of is if my son did that, would I be so open to just receive him back, or would I have a long 6-page lecture of, I told you so, here's all the things that you did wrong? If we're honest, we kind of do that, right? We say we accept people, but really we've got all this judgment, all this extra stuff. In Luke 15, we see God the Father as compassionate. We see God the Father lavishing this. He throws a party. He's proud. He celebrates. My son is back, and he's full of joy. The bottom line, he's a good father. In Luke 15, we see that God is a good father. No matter what your earthly father may have been, no matter what we see other fathers do, no matter all those flaws we see here on this earth, when we look at what Jesus said God is really like, Jesus says God is a good father. I grew up in a Christian home, and what I mean by that is for a long, long time, we were very religious. Both my grandparents, they were ordained pastors, and I grew up in a tradition that placed God first and the Bible and prayer and church attendance. It was central to everything that we do, and I thank God for that awesome foundation that I was raised with, that was laid for me. But here's the truth. None of that stuff in my family made me believe in God. I believed in church. I believed in praying to not feel guilty. I believed in hiding the way I was around my friends with the way I was around my parents. Maybe you can relate to that. Maybe you're a teenager watching this and you're getting a little cringy because you think I'm about to tell your business. Relax. I'm not going to tell on you today, but that day might come. No, I'm just playing. But seriously, I know what that's like to kind of live that double life and have a church life and a home life. And it didn't matter that I had this great foundation and that we knew the Bible and all that stuff. None of it made me believe in God. For me growing up, God was just this powerful being above, waiting for me to mess up, waiting for me to blow it. And then when I was 14 years old, my father died suddenly and unexpectedly. And for 23 months of my life after that, God was just this heartless being who rewarded my family's devotion with pain and abandonment. Maybe you can relate to that. Maybe you're going through some stuff right now wondering, where is this good father? Where is God? How can God be good? Maybe you can relate to the feelings that I had after my father died, that God is out to get me. God is cruelly indifferent. God is absent. But what if I told you that's not what God is really like? See, one summer, about 2 years after my dad died, something amazing happened to me. God started showing me what he was really like. And he didn't show me with emotional feel-goods or with magical signs. He showed me with evidence. The people who followed Jesus, I call them the Jesus people, the Christians, the Christ followers, they loved me even when I was unlovable. And they showed me that God doesn't abandon us just because we blow it. People started showing up in my life, and they were my friends even when I wasn't friendly. And I learned all of a sudden that God cares. Great men stepped up and mentored me in the absence of my father, and I learned that God is actually for me. He actually provided for me everything that I needed. Where I come from, a young man of color who loses his father, you should be in jail, you should be dead. And in my story, God showed up every time and made me more than a statistic. He gave me everything I need to set my life up for what it is now. And I'm not special. I'm no different than you are. I just know that when my earthly father couldn't be there because he was no longer alive, this good heavenly Father called God showed up every single time. What do you think about when you think about God? Why is it difficult for you right now this morning, Easter Sunday? Why is it difficult for you to think about God as being a father? I think we have to wrestle with what that says about us. See, the truth is, you're a son. You're a daughter. And when you follow Jesus, your position doesn't change. When you take a step towards him, your position doesn't change. No matter what you do, your position doesn't change. God loved the whole world so much that he gave his son Jesus that we who believe in Jesus could have life and have life forever. Not just life in heaven, but life right now. We can have it abundantly. He did that because he's good. Here's a picture of my firstborn son. This is Carlo Antonio Serrano II. Now, he's almost 21 years old now. He's a little bit bigger than this, but he's almost 21 years old. And when he was born, he had no idea what he would do with his life. He had no idea what kind of person he would become. He had no idea who God was. I had no idea what he would do, who he would become, whether he would believe in God. But see, here's the thing. None of that mattered. He's my son, and I love him. And nothing he can ever do will change his position or his standing with me. I feel the same way about my youngest son, David. My sons, they didn't have to get their lives right. They didn't have to fix their mistakes or live up to some expectation to receive my love, to receive my patience, to receive my generosity, to receive all the good that I could possibly give them. They don't have to do anything to perform to do that. I give it to them because they are my sons. And if that's how I feel about my sons, how much more does our God, our Father, feel that way about his sons, his daughters, especially the ones who are lost, especially the ones who have not yet made a decision or taken a step to follow him. Life is hard. Don't we know that, right? Life is hard, and we want to help you get it right. But here's the thing. It's hard to get life right when you've got God wrong. When we get God wrong, we turn towards selfishness. When we get God wrong, we turn towards hate. When we get God wrong, we turn towards anger. We get stuck in our frustrations when we get God wrong. We try to perform to live up to some false expectation of good. But when we view God as Father, as good Father, it makes life simple. So what do we do with all this? Next week, we're going to have some very practical application steps that you can take as we continue to build through this. But today, I just think there's one step you can make. Easter Sunday, there's one step you can make. Whether you're following Jesus or whether you've never really made a decision to follow Jesus, today there's one thing that you can do. I'm just going to ask you this. Would you consider thinking about God as your Father? Would you consider thinking about God as your Father? Remember those quotes from earlier on. Most important thing is what we think of when we think of God. And the most important thing, really, more important than that, is what God actually thinks about us. Would you consider thinking about God as your Father? That's it. It's hard to get life right when you've got God wrong. We believe that following Jesus makes your life better and makes you better at life. And that starts with getting God right. Would you consider calling God your Father right now where you're at? Would you consider just having a conversation with him? Maybe something like this. God, Father, I don't understand you. I don't know that I know you, but I want to. Or maybe it's God, Father, I've messed up and I've blown it. And I thank you that you're there for me, waiting with arms wide open to receive me back and to give me all good gifts. Maybe right now you can just say, God, Father, I have felt so alone the last 2 weeks, the last 3 weeks, but I know that you're good and I know that you're with me. Whatever that looks like for you, would you consider calling God your heavenly Father? I'm convinced if you do that, it will prepare your way of thinking for everything else. In fact, if you think of God as your Father, I think it will set the stage for you understanding what God actually thinks about you. You can't really understand God's heart for you until you're willing to call him Father, until you're willing to say yes to him, until you're willing to take a step and follow him. You really won't understand all the good stuff that God has for you. It's an opportunity for you to grow and to press in and to take an awesome step. But it starts with saying, God, I'm going to look at you as Father. In a few moments, we're going to worship again through song. And this is a song that might be familiar to some of you. Maybe you've never sung this song before, but take this moment right where you're at on this Easter Sunday morning, whether you're in your living room or you're in your bed or you're gathered around, wherever you're at, dining room table, just take this moment and use this song to process what it means to think of God as your Father. There's a line in this song that says, I've looked everywhere for answers. I've been searching, but the whole time, the answers that I need are the ones that only you can provide. I think that's what happens when we shift our thinking to viewing God as Father. So it's a simple statement. I'm going to pray for us, and then we're going to sing to or listen to this song, and I want you to really take that step of processing God as your Father. Let me pray. God, thank you so much that we can come to you, that you demonstrated your love for us, that while we were sinners and broken and running away and ruining and wrecking our lives, you showed your love by sending your Son to die for us. I thank you that you are good and that you are for us, and that if we confess that, if we just say to you, God, I know I've messed up, I need you, you show up in a powerful way and you save us. Because Jesus is alive, we can have life, we can have forgiveness, we can have hope. God, not just for a far off future, but for today, for the next moment, and for the next breath. God, for everyone engaging in this service right now, God, those watching on Facebook or YouTube or on the app, however they are processing this, God, I pray that all of us together would take this most important step of viewing you as Heavenly Father. For some, that means that first time saying, God, forgive me, I need you. For others, we need that reminder that you are with us and that you are good. Thank you so much that you're always there, arms open, ready to receive us. Help us to reflect that to this world. In the strong name of Jesus, amen. Listen, it's hard to get life right when you've got God wrong. Think of God as your Heavenly Father.
I've heard 1,000 stories of what they think you're like, but I've heard call me, deeper still as you call me, deeper still into love. Love, you're a good, good Father. It's who you are. It's who you are. It's who you are. And I'm loved by you. It's who I am. It's who I am. It's who I am. You're a good, good Father. It's who you are. It's who you are. It's who you are. And I'm loved by you. It's who I am. It's who I am. It's who I am.
Hey, we hope you enjoyed the message. And before you go, if you had any questions at all, we've started a new 5 After with Carlo and Luther. They'll be there on live Facebook to talk to you about any questions you may have and answer any questions you have. And if you missed the live version of it, feel free to comment your questions and we will absolutely get back to you.
Thank you guys so much for being with us today.
We love you so much.
Go be the church.